There is a moment when the noise of the world grows so loud it begins to echo inside your own body. You find yourself moving, speaking, even desiring, not because it rises naturally from within you, but because you have learned to follow invisible scripts. In love, in intimacy, in your own skin. Erich Fromm once said, "Immature love says, 'I love you because I need you.' Mature love says, 'I need you because I love you.'" In sexuality, this difference is vast. Many of us shape our bodies, our gestures, our touch to be wanted, not because we want, but because we fear what will happen if we are not wanted. We call it attraction, we call it connection, but often it is survival. Neuroscience tells us that our brains are wired to seek approval. Dopamine rewards us for the smile, the nod, the lingering gaze. Yet cortisol whispers anxiety into our bloodstream when we sense disapproval. Over time, this chemical dance becomes a cage. We forget the sound of our own desire. We perform, thinking it is passion. We adapt, believing it is freedom. But true sexuality, the kind that feels like breathing rather than acting, begins only when the performance ends. And so, I ask you to pause, not to fix, not to judge, but to notice. Whose eyes have you been looking through when you look at yourself? Whose approval have you been chasing in the quietest, most intimate corners of your life? Somewhere beneath all of it, beneath the roles, the stories, the expectations, there is a current that is yours alone. Perhaps it has been silent for years. Perhaps you have never truly heard it. But it is there, waiting. And if you listen closely, you might feel the first pull back toward yourself. There is a quiet pain in wanting something that never belonged to you in the first place. A longing planted in you by the gaze of others. It is the ache of living inside someone else's dream and mistaking it for your own. For many, sexuality was not born in the wild soil of curiosity or freedom, but in the carefully fenced gardens of expectation. Perhaps it was shaped by invisible traumas, the sharp edge of an early comment about your body, the chill in a room when you didn't meet someone's silent standard, or the way love seemed to come only when you behaved, looked, or moved in certain ways. These moments, small as they seemed at the time, became threads in the fabric of your desire. You began to think of your body not as a home, but as a display, a storefront window carefully arranged to draw attention, to invite approval. Every touch, every gesture, every moment of intimacy carried the weight of performance. And somewhere, deep inside, the body learned to hide its own language, its true voice, because that voice didn't always win applause. In this prison, pleasure is not felt, it is presented. You learn to read the room more than you read yourself. You memorize the cues that make others lean closer, smile longer, stay a little more. You start to confuse the satisfaction of being chosen with the fulfillment of being yourself. And the tragedy is not just that you perform, it is that you forget there was ever a time when you didn't. Sometimes the conditioning is so old, it feels like your nature. But nature is wild. It resists scripts. If you were to strip away every learned gesture, every habit of seduction designed for someone else's eyes, what would remain? Maybe there would be silence, maybe uncertainty, maybe something untamed and unshaped by anyone's expectation. That is the part of you the prison cannot touch, unless you keep the door closed yourself. Beneath many intimate encounters lies a quiet bargain, one rarely spoken, yet deeply felt. It is the silent agreement that love, attention, and belonging will only be granted if we meet certain unspoken standards. Somewhere along the way, a deep fear took root. If I am not pleasing, I will be left behind. This fear is not born in adulthood. It is the echo of childhood rooms where needs went unanswered, of eyes that looked past us, of moments where the warmth of connection was tied to our ability to perform or adapt. This is the wound of abandonment, a subtle but enduring current that flows into our sexual patterns. We may not notice it, but it is there in the way the body tenses when we sense disapproval, in the way our gestures shift to match the unspoken desires of another, in the way we mold ourselves to keep love from slipping away. In these moments, intimacy is not an expression of desire. It is a negotiation for safety. Neuroscience shows us that the brain rewards approval with dopamine, feeding the illusion that this cycle is pleasure. But when the absence of approval arrives, cortisol floods in, bringing anxiety, restlessness, and the desperate impulse to correct whatever made us fall short. Over time, this becomes a loop. Please, receive validation, fear its loss. Please, again. The repetition feels like desire, but in truth, it is survival dressed as intimacy. This pact, once formed, often remains hidden in the background of relationships. It whispers that love is conditional, that worth is measured in the eyes of others, that rejection is only ever one unmet expectation away. It asks you to stay small, to anticipate, to edit yourself before you have even spoken. And perhaps the most dangerous part of this pact is how familiar it feels. We mistake it for normal. We call it connection. But it is a connection that costs us the freedom to be fully seen. There is a story we are told, especially in modern times, that sexual freedom is the same as sexual liberation. That if the rules have been torn down, if nothing is forbidden, we must therefore be free. But freedom built on performance is still performance. Sometimes, the banner of everything is allowed hides a more subtle form of control, the pressure to be endlessly available, endlessly desirable, endlessly adventurous. The stage has changed, but the audience is still there, watching, expecting. In this space, it becomes difficult to distinguish between being free and being wanted. One can move through 100 encounters, collect 1,000 moments of desire directed toward them, and still feel a hollow quiet when the lights go out. The skin may remember touches, but the soul remains untouched. The body may be praised, but the self inside it remains unseen. It is here that self-exploration can turn into self-exploitation, where the pursuit of sensation masks the absence of connection. Nietzsche once warned of the danger of the void, that when meaning is stripped away, we may rush to fill it with anything that stirs us, no matter how fleeting. In the realm of sexuality, this can look like chasing intensity simply to feel alive. The risk is that the excess becomes a stand-in for depth. We think we are tasting freedom, but in truth, we are trying to drown out the silence that follows us home. True liberation cannot be measured by how much we can do, but by how deeply we can be. If every choice is still shaped by the need to be seen, approved of, or envied, then the script has not been broken. It has only been rewritten. And sometimes, the most radical act is not to push further outward into excess, but to turn inward into the parts of us that have never needed to be on display at all. There is a common thread woven through many relationships: the belief that the intensity of desire must be proof of love. The rush of chemistry, the pulse of attraction, the heat of longing can feel so consuming that we mistake it for a deeper connection. Neuroaffective science explains how this happens. The same chemicals that ignite physical attraction can blur the lines between emotional compatibility and biological reaction. What feels like destiny may be no more than a surge of dopamine and oxytocin, powerful enough to mimic intimacy, but too fragile to sustain it. This confusion often traps us in a cycle. We chase the high of desire, believing it is the foundation of love. And when that high inevitably fades, as all chemical peaks do, we assume something is broken. In that gap, Some turn to attachment through the body as a substitute for attachment through the soul. Sex becomes a placeholder for closeness, a way to bridge the silence without truly meeting each other in it. It is not an expression of shared essence, but an attempt to avoid the emptiness that surfaces when the chemistry cools. For others, the body becomes a shield against self-awareness. The repetition of encounters, the constant search for new sparks, becomes a way to outrun the deeper question: what remains of me when there is no one to want me? In this way, compulsion disguises itself as pleasure. The chase for desire becomes less about joy and more about escape. Escape from the stillness where the truth of our loneliness waits. Love, when it is real, can hold desire, but it does not depend on it for survival. Desire may begin the story, but love continues it when the fire burns low. The tragedy of this distorted model is not that desire fades. It is that, in chasing its return, we may never discover the quieter, steadier forms of love that are not written in the body's urgency, but in the soul's recognition. Somewhere beneath the noise of performance and the weight of expectation lies a quieter truth, a form of desire that has never been shaped for display, never been rehearsed for an audience. It is the kind that does not shout for attention but hums softly in the background, waiting for the space to be heard. This is the desire that belongs only to you, untouched by anyone's approval or rejection. To find it, the body must be invited back into honesty. It is not about grand gestures or elaborate fantasies, but about noticing what stirs you when no one is watching. There is a difference between what excites the body and what nourishes the soul. The first may bring a rush, a fleeting brightness that quickly fades. The second lingers. It fills, steadies, and feels less like a spark and more like a deep current. Yet we often confuse the two, reaching for what is loudest rather than what is most real. Reconnection requires a kind of listening that is almost sacred. It means allowing yourself to explore not as a performer, but as a witness to your own inner landscape. Imagine standing before a mirror, not to judge, not to arrange, but to simply see skin, breath, pulse, without narrative or script. This is not the mirror of comparison or seduction, but a mirror of presence, one that reflects back the body as a home rather than a tool. When you begin to meet yourself in this way, the need for external validation loosens its hold. Desire shifts from being a currency of exchange to being a language you speak fluently to yourself. It is a reconnection that is not about control or conquest, but about returning to a place where intimacy is an act of truth, not performance. And in that truth, the silent desire you once buried begins to rise again, unrushed, unfiltered, undeniably yours. Jung believed that the parts of ourselves we push into the shadows are often the ones that hold the greatest keys to our wholeness. In sexuality, these shadowed places are not always the acts we perform, but the desires we refuse to admit to ourselves. The ones we fear will unravel the identity we have carefully built. The ones we bury under layers of moral restraint, cultural conditioning, and the fear of what they might reveal about who we really are. The shadow is not the enemy. It is the keeper of truths too raw to be spoken openly. When we repress certain desires, they do not disappear. They slip underground, shaping our choices from beneath the surface. They might emerge in dreams, in fleeting thoughts, in unexplained longings, or they may erupt in ways we cannot control, as if the self we have exiled is demanding to be let back in. For Jung, sexuality could be a gateway to individuation, the process of becoming whole. because it forces us to confront the split between who we are and who we pretend to be. In this way, intimacy becomes less about pleasure and more about integration. To meet your own shadowed desires without judgment is to reclaim a part of your own essence. Within this framework lies the figure of the wounded lover, the archetype who has been cut off from their own body by the moralistic mind. This lover moves through life as though love and desire were separate worlds, never fully inhabiting either. Healing this fracture is not about indulgence. It is about bringing the exiled parts of the self back into the circle of acceptance. Only then can sexuality stop being a battlefield between desire and obedience, and become instead a meeting place of body, soul, and truth. For many, pleasure does not arrive alone. It comes carrying a shadow, a faint weight that lingers even in the moments meant to be free. This is the inheritance of a moral code that taught us to measure goodness by restraint, to equate virtue with self-denial. In such a system, pleasure becomes suspect, something to be justified or hidden, an indulgence that must be earned rather than a birthright to be embraced. This conditioning often begins long before we have any conscious awareness of sexuality. It lives in the subtle glances, in the silence that falls when certain topics arise, in the quiet disapproval etched into the faces of those we sought to please. By the time we begin exploring our own bodies and desires, the script is already written. Pleasure is dangerous, and those who seek it too openly will pay a price. The body remembers these lessons, carrying an invisible tension even in the softest moments of intimacy. This guilt does not always feel like shame. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation, as a sudden need to pull back just as we begin to feel more, as the urge to distract ourselves when the experience becomes too deep. It is as if the mind, trained by generations of restraint, does not know how to trust what is unfolding. Often this weight is not even ours. It is the residue of a transgenerational inheritance, passed down through unspoken rules and inherited fears. In this inner conflict, the body becomes a field of negotiation between longing and obedience. Pleasure calls us to dissolve into the present moment, while guilt pulls us back into the safety of control. And yet, beneath both forces, there is a quieter truth, that pleasure, when it is honest and chosen, does not corrupt. It connects. It reminds us that to be fully alive is to allow both the soul and the senses to speak without apology. She was 37 when the realization came, not with a sudden shock, but with a slow, undeniable clarity. For 2 decades, she had moved through intimacy as if on a stage, adjusting her movements, her sounds, even her breath to match an invisible script. Every encounter had been a performance, a choreography learned from partners, films, and fragments of advice. She had touched herself, yes, but always with the silent presence of an imagined audience, never with pure, unfiltered curiosity. It was during a season of deep personal unraveling that she began to notice the hollowness. The relationships that had once seemed passionate felt, in hindsight, like rehearsals. She could recall how her body had been admired, how her gestures had been praised, yet she could not remember the last time she had felt entirely at home within her own skin. This absence was not about the lack of partners. It was about the absence of herself in her own experience. She began, slowly, to unlearn. What she called the vibrational reconnection was not a method taught in any book. It was a series of moments spent alone, allowing herself to sense without rushing, to feel without editing. She stopped imagining how she looked and began noticing how she felt. The change was not instant. There were days of discomfort, of confronting the ways she had abandoned herself in the pursuit of being chosen. But gradually, the language of her body returned to her, syllable by syllable. What she found was not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet liberation. The hunger for external approval loosened. Desire stopped feeling like a currency and began to feel like a conversation, one between her and her own soul. She no longer measured pleasure by how much she could give or how well she could please, but by the depth of her presence in each moment. And in that presence, she discovered something she had never known: intimacy that belonged entirely to her, even when no one else was there to witness it. Fromm's words still echo. Immature love says, "I love you because I need you." Mature love says, "I need you because I love you." In the realm of sexuality, this distinction is a compass. One points toward performance, the endless bending and shaping of the self to be worthy of desire. The other points toward authenticity, a way of being that allows desire to rise naturally, without the need to be curated for someone else's gaze. Over these moments together, we have walked through the silent prisons built from expectation, the hidden pacts forged in fear of rejection, the seductive illusions of excess disguised as freedom. We have seen how desire can be mistaken for love, how guilt can cling to pleasure, how the shadow holds the truth of our impulses, and how liberation often begins with the smallest act of turning inward. The journey back to oneself is rarely loud. It does not announce its arrival with grand declarations. It begins in subtle ways, in the noticing, in the listening, in the reclaiming of moments that once belonged only to the performance. Authentic sexuality is not about how much you can do, how many boundaries you can break, or how many eyes you can draw to you. It is about whether you can stand in the quiet of your own being and feel that what moves you is yours. And so, a question remains, one that does not demand an immediate answer, but lingers like a hand resting gently on the door to your own depths. Who would you be if your sexuality were nothing more than a dialogue between you and your own soul? Perhaps the truest form of freedom is not in being seen, but in being known, first and foremost, by yourself. If these reflections stirred something in you, if they touched a part of you that you don't often show the world, then stay with this journey. This space exists so that you never have to navigate the complexity of your inner world alone. Here, we speak of the shadow without fear, of desire without shame, of freedom without performance. Subscribe and allow yourself to return to this circle of reflection, where every week we go deeper into the truths we're not taught to name. Share this video with someone you sense is also searching for more than the surface, someone who might need a quiet reminder that they are not broken, only waiting to meet themselves again. And as you go, carry this thought with you. Your intimacy is not a performance to be perfected. It is a language to be reclaimed. The dialogue begins when you are ready to listen.